There are three tenses in ancient Greek that can be used to express past actions. The imperfect, showing ongoing or repeated action in the past. The aorist, showing simple action. And the rare pluperfect, showing action that had occurred and its results have continued into the more recent past. All three tenses use secondary or historic endings, and all three use an augment at the front of the verb stem. Since the pluperfect is so rare, however, this lesson will focus on the two most common tenses, the imperfect and the aorist. We will start with the imperfect tense. The imperfect deals with incomplete or continuous actions in the past. It is formed by taking the present stem of the verb, adding on an augment, then adding on the secondary active or middle passive ending. There are two indicators of the past tense, the augment and the secondary endings. The secondary ending is going to be the easiest way to identify the verb. The ending doesn't change much word to word, and they were always there. The augment will change a little depending on what the stem of the verb starts with. If the stem starts with a consonant, the epsilon with a smooth breathing mark will just be added to the front of the stem. If the stem starts with a vowel, the augment will lengthen whatever vowel is on the front of the stem. One last thing to note is that when an augment is added to a verb with a prefix, the augment will come after the prefix. So to identify imperfects, just watch out for a long vowel or a diphthong at the front of a verb and the secondary endings. Great news! The imperfect tense only exists in the indicative, meaning that this is all you will have to remember. No infinitives, imperatives, or participles. The imperfect is translated a couple of different ways. What you need to remember is that the verb shows an incomplete action. One way to translate the verb is with the ing suffix. This was an action that took place over a period of time. Another way to translate the verb is, I used to do blank. This is also an action that took place over a period of time, but this translation may make more sense depending on the context. Next, let's talk about the aorist. The aorist tense shows a single, simple action in the past. There are two types of aorists, helpfully called the first and second aorist. Most verbs only have a first aorist form. A smaller group only have a second aorist. We'll break them apart and tackle them one by one. The first aorist, or the weak aorist, is formed by taking the present stem of the verb, adding on the augment, then adding sigma alpha before the secondary active or middle passive endings. There are three indicators of the past tense in the first aorist. Like the imperfect, there is the augment and the secondary endings. More importantly, the way you can tell the first aorist from the imperfect is the sigma alpha indicator. The sigma alpha is sometimes hidden by other consonants. If the verb ends in beta, p, or phi, also called labials because they are sounds made with your lips, then the sigma becomes a psi. Pempo is a good example. The stem of the verb ends in p. Then, because it is a first aorist verb, the p turns into psi. If the verb ends in gamma, kappa, or he, the velars, sounds made with the back of your tongue, sigma can also be a xi. With archo, the ki at the end of the verb becomes a xi. If the verb ends in delta, theta, tau, or zeta, which are the dentals made just above your teeth, that consonant will fall away and be replaced by the sigma. This will change the present stem just a tiny bit, so keep an eye out for these kinds of verbs. Comisto ends in zeta, which drops out in favor of the sigma from the sigma alpha indicator. Almost the opposite effect of these verbs are verbs that end in lambda or rho, the liquids made with sounds resonating in your mouth, or mu or nu, the nasals made with sounds resonating in your nose. The sigma will fall away instead. We can see this happen with kathairo. The sigma falls away in the aorist, leaving the rho behind next to the alpha from the indicator. The alpha will always be there, just before the secondary ending. Outside of the indicative, the first aorist infinitives, imperatives, and participles will not have an augment. However, the sigma alpha is retained. The second aorist is next. The second aorist is similar to verbs in English that change form from present to past tense, such as run to ran, sing to sang, and get to got. The second aorist also makes a stem change in its formation. The second aorist makes use of the aorist stem, or the root stem of a verb, which looks a bit shorter than the present stem. This stem can sometimes be found by removing some extra letters from the end of the present stem. Two syllables may drop out are sko and nu. Here's that new stem. Some will simply have to be memorized. This only works for regular second aorist verbs. This will not work if the verb has an irregular aorist stem. The second aorist is formed by taking the aorist stem, adding the augment, then adding only the secondary active or middle passive endings. There is no sigma alpha indicator, meaning you're not going to be able to rely on it to recognize these verbs. This is where it is hard to tell the difference between the second aorist and the imperfect. The key thing to remember is that the aorist stem looks different. Like with the first aorist, outside of the indicative mood, there is no augment. There is also no sigma alpha indicator. The aorist is translated to show the simple action idea. Usually this is shown through the suffix ed. Some second aorist verbs have irregular forms. These verbs make a change in stem, much like the English verb go turns into went. Here are just a few of these verbs. They don't look like they would be irregular, but here's their aorist form. There's no simple trick to their irregular transformation, so the best way to recognize these verbs is to memorize which present stem they are from, and remember to check the ending to see if it's a secondary ending. Try guessing these three. These are some of the most common irregular verbs. The next portion of our lesson will be on the aorist passive. The reason this has been separated is because unlike the imperfect or the present passives, the aorist passive is not made with the middle form of the verb and context. There are two forms of the aorist passive, but the difference between the two is very small. One form of the aorist passive is made by taking the present stem, adding on the augment, then adding theta eta before the secondary endings. This is the big indicator of the voice. A number of verbs will also add a sigma before the theta eta indicator. Another form of the aorist passive is made in the same way, but the indicator is only an eta. This is a little harder to recognize, but it will still clue you into the passive voice. The other moods also use the theta eta or just the eta, depending on the form of the indicative. Participles will use theta epsilon or just epsilon instead. Again, there's no augment outside of the indicative. Now for a little practice, here's a sentence from the Labors of Theseus using the imperfect and aorist. See if you can identify the verbs using the formation tools you have learned. Proton mengar periphetein ton hephaistu kai antikleas, hos apotes corunes hen ephorein corunetes epikaleto ectenen en epidauro. There are three verbs in this sentence in the imperfect or the aorist. The first verb is ephore, so running through our identification method, look for the augment. Then we look to see what the stem is, which looks to be from the word phoreo. Because the stem hasn't changed and there's a secondary ending, this must be an imperfect verb. The second verb is epikaleto. Now this verb has a prefix, epi, so we have to look in between the prefix and the stem to see if the verb has an augment. The third letter is an epsilon, which means it does have an augment. The stem is from the verb kaleo, which is unchanged in this verb. So, with the secondary ending, this verb is in the imperfect. The third and final verb is ektenen. The augment is right in the front. The stem seems to be from the word kateno, so maybe this verb is in the imperfect. However, the secondary ending is a bit different for the imperfect. If you remember, sometimes the sigma of the first aorist is hidden by other consonants. In this case, the stem of the verb ends in nu, so the sigma would fall away, meaning this verb is in the aorist. This lesson has explained how to form the imperfect, the first and second aorist, and the aorist passive. To form the imperfect, take the present stem and add on the augment, then the correct secondary ending. To form the first aorist, use the present stem, add on the augment, then put the indicator sigma alpha before the proper secondary ending. To form the second aorist, take the aorist stem, add on the augment, then the correct secondary ending. Finally, the aorist passive is formed with the present stem, the augment, then the theta eta indicator before the ending. Remember to look for what makes each formation unique. I hope this lesson was helpful in your language learning.